Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka. Ka tangi hoki ahau, ti hei mauri ora. Ko tuirangi te maunga, ko kakanui te awa, ko mahuhu ki te rangi te waka, ko Ngāti Whātua Kaiparati iwi, ko Ngāti Rango te hapu. Ko kakanui te marae, i ngā iwi huhui mai nei i tēnei wānau mai hara mai ki tēnei hui tēnei ata, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. So my name's Leonie Hayden, and my ancestors hail from South Kaipara, northwest of Auckland, and they were brought here on the waka mahuhu ki te rangi. And I'm the editor of Mana magazine, this is our latest issue with Julian Dennison from Hunt for the Wilder People on the cover. I'm very honoured to be here today to talk to you guys about Māori media. A bit of background about the magazine. It was founded in 1993 by 3 journalists, 2 Māori and 1 non-Māori, Piripi Whanga, Derek Fox and Gary Wilson, who published 117 issues of Mana until 2014. And at this point, the publishers found that their subscriptions and their sales had stalled, and they were struggling to keep up with the modern publishing landscape. Pretty familiar scenario for a lot of magazine titles. And they announced that Mana was going to call it a day. Kōwhai Media, who are the publishers of New Zealand Geographic and Pro Photographer magazine, came along and they committed to taking over publishing Mana. And they hired me as their editor, and that was in August 2014, and I've just published my 10th issue. So what's Māori media? They're media outlets that cover stories and personalities within te ao Māori, the Māori world, that are considered newsworthy. So these are some examples of Māori media that you will probably recognise. So why are these stories newsworthy to Māori and not to the greater public? Bear with me, I am by no means a treaty scholar, and there are literally hundreds of much sharper minds than mine that have devoted their entire lives to deconstructing post-colonialism and te tiriti. But however, as with all things Māori, this too needs to be given its proper historical context. Now, the media has the distinct privilege of deciding which stories and viewpoints to place value on. And for the most part, they'll try to represent a variety of stories and viewpoints that appeal to the broadest demographic, and this is how a fair and unbiased media should work. Māori now only make up 16% of New Zealand's population, and so the media and our government has found it very easy to marginalise the opinions and the viewpoints of Māori. So why does it matter? If we're such a minority, why does representation matter? Well, it's widely acknowledged that New Zealand's a multicultural country, but that often skips over the fact that it was founded as a bicultural nation. It was a partnership between 2 cultures, Māori and the British. And the Declaration of Independence 5 years prior notwithstanding, the document that formalised that partnership was the Treaty of Waitangi. And at that point in our history, Māori were not a minority. The population of Māori in New Zealand in 1840 was estimated to be somewhere between 70,000 and 90,000, and the population of British settlers was about 2,000. As we now all know, the British were very good at waltzing into a place and declaring that the people who live there are speaking the wrong language and wearing the wrong clothes and thinking the wrong thoughts. So what ensued for Māori is 175 years of alienation from land and language and culture. We also now know that the government acknowledges that fairness hasn't been shown to Māori because the Waitangi Tribunal was established in 1975 to hear grievances against Māori relating to actions or omissions by the Crown that breached the promises made in the Treaty of Waitangi. And the New Zealand government, after 130 years of willful ignorance of the treaty, finally acknowledged that our founding document and the partnership that was entered into that day should be honoured and its principles upheld, which included, among others, that the Crown agrees to protect Māori interests and that Māori are to have all the rights and privileges of citizenship. And to me, that extends to the right to fair representation in the media, not as a form of tokenism, but with sincerity and integrity. It's not just a political issue, in as much it's not just politicians and iwi leaders that should be talking about treaty partnership. Our sports, our arts, business, health and education, media all need to recognise Te Tiriti o Waitangi in order to honour those promises and build the bicultural partnership that was originally envisioned by all of our ancestors, Māori and Pākehā. So it had to start somewhere. The very first Māori radio news bulletin started in 1940. Now, during World War II, if your son or husband was killed or missing in action, you received a telegram from the New Zealand Armed Forces. Except if you were Māori, you were informed via a Sunday night radio broadcast where the names of the dead and missing were just read out in a list. This was New Zealand's first Māori radio news. And these Sunday night broadcasts drew complaints from some listeners, and not because it's a cruel and awful way to deliver that kind of news, and so patently unfair to the families who were paying exactly the same price as other families that were receiving a personalised telegram. No, people complained because of the foreign language that was interrupting their Sunday night listening. And it turns out not much has changed. Last year we did a story about the use of tikanga Māori and te reo Māori in the mainstream media after weather presenter Kānoa Lloyd revealed that she was receiving weekly complaints about using terms like te Waipounamu instead of the South Island or Kirikiriroa instead of Hamilton. And I think going back to those complaints during World War II, the clue's in the word foreign. We all fear the familiar. That's like a really universal human trait, and we're a bit frightened by things that we don't understand. And a lot of older Pākehā New Zealanders have never viewed themselves as being part of a bicultural society because they were serviced by a government and a workforce and a media that saw itself as a miniature of the British Empire. Māori culture's always been tolerated rather than embraced, kind of like, you know, an embarrassing relative that you have to see a couple of times a year, but you don't really think about them at any other time. These New Zealanders were not required to engage with Māori culture, nor were they shown the value of it. And so to them, to many of them, our language and our culture is ugly because it's foreign. Now, it's not like the mainstream media ignores Māori issues completely. We feature quite regularly. But our stories are not always told with our community in mind. The late director Barry Barclay, who was actually also married to our first Māori female film director, Merita Mita, he talked about talking in and talking out in his book, Our Own Image, about New Zealand filmmaking. Talking in being where a community tells its own stories to each other, and talking out being where a community tells a story to another community. So a Pākehā making a film about Māori rather than a Māori making a film about Māori. And here's an example of how mainstream media often talks about Māori issues. You could, in this case, even uncharitably just call it misrepresentation. But one of the most popular news stories in the media these days is around treaty settlement money, especially if someone is deemed to have frittered it away. So this is the headline the New Zealand Herald ran in January last year, accompanying an article detailing the financial losses incurred by the Tūwharetoa Settlement Trust, 5 years since receiving their share of the Central North Island settlement. And this headline clearly implies that criminal behaviour by a settlement trust may have led to the loss of $50 million. I'm not going to tell you exactly what people had to say in the comments underneath this article. It wasn't nice, and most of them were something along the lines of, we should stop giving useless, lazy, greedy Maoris money. But something about this story didn't sit right with me. $50 million is a hell of a lot of money to just lose. So I commissioned a writer to investigate a bit further. The writer's name is Joshua Hitchcock. He's from Ngāti Awa, and he's a financial consultant for Deloitte. And here's what he found. $43 million of the $50 million loss were distributions to hapu, sub-tribes of Tūwharetoa, that the Tūwharetua Settlement Trust was required to make as part of the settlement. That was a previously agreed upon sum that was to be distributed to members of the hapu for marae and community maintenance, for social services, for whatever had been agreed in the settlement. So the lost $50 million was actually $7 million. And an independent report of Tūwharetua's spending and investment activities over that 5 years did highlight several issues of concern. So the Tūwharetua Settlement Trust reported in their 2014 financial report to members that steps were being undertaken to address these issues. The underlying message to members was that investment losses of around $7 million had been identified and written off, and a new approach to investing was being adopted. Now, it's not awesome, but $7 million loss over 5 years for an iwi finding their feet and learning from their investment mistakes is actually perfectly on par with other comparably large corporate entities. And how they went about examining it and reporting it to their members and reporting the losses was also exactly how any other corporation would have behaved. And not only that, but in the 2014 annual report, it showed that their total assets, not just their cash assets, but their total assets, had actually increased from 71 million to 81 million in the previous 5 years. So in fact, there wasn't actually any loss whatsoever overall. But why let facts get in the way of a good story? Because that was a much better headline. So this isn't an isolated event, obviously. In 2012, a research team consisting of 6 academics calling themselves Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga proved this statement made by Ranganui Walker in the 1980s. By publishing a paper in the New Zealand Journal of Indigenous Scholarship that examined television news coverage of Māori stories gathered from Te Kaya on Māori television, TV1, both English language newscasts and Te Karere, TV3 and Prime Television during a 6-month period. And they looked at how many Māori stories there were and the tone of each piece. And they found that Māori stories made up less than 2% of the news items in the English language newscasts, and that the majority of these items encouraged viewers to think about Māori in terms of violence towards and abuse of babies and children. Now, could it be that in the past, say, 20 years, there have been no newsworthy stories about Māori that weren't about criminality or treaty settlements? Of course not. I offer 128 issues of mana as proof. It's more like 11, but I ran out of time. Now, within the Mana archive lives astonishing achievements, historical landmarks, mystery, mythology, poetry, politics, and this is how we choose to flip the script on that negativity by telling stories to each other so that we don't drown in the Kool-Aid that we've been offered by the mainstream media. And now since Kōwhai Media has taken over publishing Mana and I have come on board, my own priority is to involve non-Māori in the conversation. I choose stories that have interesting characters and tension and intrigue, or serious data or artistic value, anything that will appeal to anyone picking up the magazine. I'm not compromising my values of telling our stories, but I'm prioritising some of the industry standards that ensure a magazine title will appeal to people and attract advertisers and create social media buzz. And as anyone working in the magazine industry will tell you, a story is only as good as it looks, which is to say if I stuff 1,000 words onto a page with a small low-res image, no one's going to read it. It could be a Pulitzer Prize winner, but no one would pick that story up. And I think the barrier to a lot of people picking up or watching or listening to Māori media, especially the type of bibliophiles that love print, is the design, which is not usually produced by an award-winning graphic or web designer, because absolutely everything to do with Māori media is chronically underfunded. And I don't mean Māori design like kōwhaiwhai or koru, although I think subconsciously sometimes people see those things and think, oh, this is not for me. But I just mean how things are laid out on a page or a web page, the quality of the photos that tell a story, covers that look just as good on the shelf next to Metro or Home and Garden. And so this is how I hope to draw other communities into reading about Māori culture and mana, using my New Zealand Geographic award-winning art director Mark Backwell, to pique the interest of people who've never noticed us before. So I want to go back to this cover and talk about it as an example of embracing kaupapa Māori, of being entirely of Te Ao Māori, while also telling a visual story that anyone can understand or enjoy. This is my favourite mana cover that I've produced, and it's not just because she's a beautiful woman looking badass with an awesome message. This feature and cover shoot was done with 100% iwi Māori talent. The writer, Simon Daves of Tainui, the amazing photographer, Damien Nikora of Ngāti Kahungunu, the stylist from Te Rarawa, and the photographer, and our makeup artist and hair artist from Ngāpui, the designers, Salasai and Nine, the jewellery designers, Nikki Moore and Arita Wilkinson. And I saw this on the shelf in the New World next to a fashion magazine, and I knew that it looked just as good as that other magazine, but I also knew that it was entirely of our community. So the point of all of this, the people in this room are here because you're not the type of person that would leave a racist or a bigoted comment on a website, unless you've specifically come to hate watch this talk, which would be weird. Presumably you came to see a talk about Māori media because you're either a part of the Māori media or you're someone with an interest in it and you're an open-minded and tolerant and wonderful person. In which case you're ready to be a part of the conversation and a part of the partnership. But here's a trap that a lot of really wonderful open-minded people fall into, and it's one of the reasons stereotypes and the otherness of some cultures continues. If you're non-Māori or non-Pacifica or not part of a minority or immigrant culture, then I just really don't ever want you to say, I'm colourblind, I don't see race. Because at this point in time, you're equally matched by people that do see race, and by a system that doesn't acknowledge our treaty partnerships, and by police and courts that make subconscious snap decisions based on skin colour. And we need you to see race and culture. We need you to see our race and our culture in order for us to not be other anymore. We're already proud of us and our complement, and we have been for years, but now we need all of you to see us as well, and to watch us, and to listen to us, and to read us. Nō reira ngā mihi ki a koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.